All right. Looks like we're live. Welcome to another episode of Friends of Wisdom here at Beyond the Fundamentals. Today we have Pastor Tanner. So just a quick background. Last week we spoke with Dr. Michael Martin, and Tanner reached out to us and about a little thread line that came out in the little Michael Martin dialogue that he communicated that he had some interesting thoughts on. So Tanner and I spoke back and forth for a little bit, and what we'd like to try and draw out in this episode here is a couple of layered things. Tanner's got some pretty interesting stuff to say as far as I'm concerned with the book, Iain McGilchrist's book, The Master and His Emissary, and how that overlays, thanks, Tanner, how that overlays in the picture of Christianity in the form of church history, and that maybe we could use what Iain McGilchrist has to say in sort of cultivating how we should proceed forward. So, yeah, welcome to Beyond the Fundamentals, Tanner.
Thank you so much, Nick. It's a blast to be on here with you. I appreciate the invite.
So just one other little logistical thing. Tanner's wife is close to pregnancy. So at any moment, he could have to have that priority, require him to be elsewhere. So we'll keep her in our thoughts as we're going back and forth here, and wish her well and you well with that.
Oh, I appreciate that.
So we were talking back and forth. And so what was, just generally speaking, if you want to give a small little introduction to yourself, where you're coming from, that kind of stuff, so that we can start digging into some of the stuff you have to say. And then I'll sort of simultaneously try to respond and let the audience know what I'm trying to do in this dialogue here, because there's a couple layered things that we want to try and bring out, hubristically, but try and bring out in this dialogue.
Sure. No, I'd be glad to. So my name's Tanner, and I've been a pastor for 3 years at a small Baptist church here in the middle of Colorado. I'm actually in the middle of the Rockies, a small little town called Leadville. And like I said, pastor only 3 years, and just kind of getting used to it, getting my feet wet, understanding the environment, what I'm supposed to be doing, interacting, all that type of stuff. I'm of a Baptistic persuasion, and I've, interacted some with Presbyterians, went to a Presbyterian seminary. And so that's kind of the framework, very evangelical. And my church was probably about half what I would describe as a little bit more fundamentalistic, and then about half just kind of maybe Southern Baptist type. And so that's kind of roughly the framework from which I'm working. And I was observing some of the phenomenon with Jordan Peterson and John Vervaeke and a lot of what's going on here on YouTube, where there seems to be this interest in Christianity, but kind of from a more secular distance type of thing. Right. And then that's associated a little bit with neuroscience and all of those different movements. And I found on Beyond the Fundamentals that you guys are really digging into that and how kind of brain chemistry works and how that matches up with our faith and all of those ideas. And so that really intrigued me quite a bit. Well, one of the names that comes up in these circles and discussions is the name of Iain McGilchrist. Mm-hmm. And I actually think he doesn't get as much attention as maybe he deserves when it comes to some of his ideas. And I'm not sure why that is, but when I read The Master and His Emissary, it completely changed how I started looking at all of these ideas and all of these categories. So as a new pastor, just trying to get this stuff sorted out, and then noticing all of these different movements and just getting a sense of the church is reaching an interesting point in history. And I think we're actually on the cusp of something where we're going to see a bit of a transformation in how the church moves forward. And I don't know that any denomination is better poised to do this than Protestantism, given our background and our history, right? We're not against a little bit of changing things up. And so I think we could really have something to offer in this space as we interact with these ideas, but it's also a world that's fraught with difficulty. And so just trying to navigate it is very, very hard. And like I said, Iain McGilchrist really gave me a little bit of a framework to I had boxes to put these things in and to try and assess and make sense of what was going on. And then that has kind of helped me to develop some of my ideas, even in my church with how we do discipleship and things like that. And then of course in online ministry spaces as well.
Okay. So that's really great. This is really exciting. So one of the things I want to surprise you with and the audience is I want to try and do this little experimental technique in this conversation, which I'm hoping that it will relay some sort of a practical technique in terms of dialoguing with someone else that someone can internalize and also use as a sort of meditation or self-conversation technique. And also I think that it sets the stage and highlights some of the major points that Iain McGilchrist is making in his book. And so what I want to do is, do you play chess at all?
Yeah, I actually enjoy chess quite a bit. I'm not good, but I like it.
Okay, yeah, neither am I. But I like to play chess. And so there's this particular game that some grandmasters like to play, and it's called Hand and Brain. I don't know if you've ever heard of it.
Yep, I'm familiar. I've actually watched some streamers playing it. It's quite entertaining.
Okay. So here's the experiment. I think that what Hand and Brain is trying to do is exactly what Iain McGilchrist is trying to say. The brain, our cognitive agency is how it's moving through the world. And that if a proper relationship can be established between the hand and the brain, or the right hemisphere and the left hemisphere, then we can cultivate insight and see different things and have a relationship with that which is true. So for the audience, the way that hand and brain is played is in a chess game. Two people get together and they play with one of the sets of pieces, so either black or white, and then one person is the brain and one person is the hand. And so what the brain does is they announce what the name of the piece that they want the hand to move. So on the first move, the brain would say something like pawn, and so now the hand has to try and figure out which pawn the brain is intending for him to move and make the proper move with it. So as the game progresses through the lines of play, it gets very complex, and we start to see the irony and sort of a little bit of the humor about how we sometimes have the ability to sort of anticipate or be on the same page with each other, but that the discrepancies between the hand and the brain or between two people can be sort of very vast. And you could be, so like if you're the brain and you're saying knight, and then the hand makes a move with the knight that you actually didn't anticipate. It happens all the time. And so now you as the brain have to try and see the bigger picture of the course of the game and of the chessboard and adjust to what the left or to what the hand did. So if this sounds kind of complicated, just give it some time. So what I want to try to do in this conversation is that Tanner has as far as I'm concerned, pretty articulate and insightful things to say. So I want to try and put myself in the position of the brain in this game, or the right hemisphere, and try to select or orient the parameters by which he is going to lead us. And then as he moves, I will try to respond based on that movement and keeping in mind the bigger picture. So a success here will be if the audience can see through these layers of what we're trying to do here. How's that sound, Tanner?
Yeah, I love it. And it maps perfectly onto McGilchrist category. So yeah, that sounds good to me.
Okay, cool. So let's play. So first move. You had mentioned in that one of the first items was this notion of a right-left handoff paradigm, right? So what are you meaning? What are you meaning by that?
Yeah, so this to me is one of the greatest insights that Iain McGilchrist offers. And I think it really has to do with a conceptual framework more than I'm interested in the neuroscience behind it. I do want you to know that there are some people that, debate how much of a difference there is between the hemispheres. The hemisphere lateralization underwent kind of a pop psychology phase, 30 years ago or so, somewhere in there. And it fell out of vogue for a while. And so when McGilchrist brought this idea back up, a lot of people were skeptical, but it looks like with more nuance added to the framework that there is some validity to it. Now, McGilchrist will say at the outset that the hemispheres are more alike than they are different, and they share tasks and they share roles very, very often. But there is some specialization to them, and it's that specialization and those differences that matter. So That's kind of how he frames it. But again, I'm more interested in the concept of how he puts it forward for sense making and just trying to move forward as the church in an internet and digital age where we're overwhelmed with so much information.
Yes.
And so what the right handoff is, he actually illustrates it by way of music. And I'll get to the musical illustration in a second. But he essentially says when you first perceive something, it's your right hemisphere that is more active. You perceive something, and he says you perceive it as a whole, as an entire picture, right? You're not getting any fine-grained details yet. You're just perceiving the whole picture, the big picture idea. And then what happens is, as you try to analyze what you're seeing, then it's as though the brain hands that information off to the left hemisphere, and the left hemisphere then begins to dissect it, fill in the details, and put together a system where it's kind of cutting it up into pieces and parts, individual bits, so that it can analyze it. Now, that's very powerful. And this left hemisphere is often what we're tapping into when we're engaged in things like science and mathematics, things that require a lot of rigorous calculation and where you need to make fine-grained distinctions between ideas. And so we do that very well. But, and this is why the book is entitled The Master and the Emissary, he's trying to identify which is which. And he says the left hemisphere, once it's chopped everything up into its pieces and parts, into its details, okay, it has the details, but it thinks it's the master, when in reality, it is merely the emissary. So the left hemisphere likes to take all of its insights and hide them close to the chest. I'm not going to share these with anyone. These are mine, right? And it thinks it knows everything. It thinks it knows the world really well. And it's just going to keep these insights to itself. However, what McGilchrist says, the next and final step that needs to happen is the left hemisphere needs to hand off the information back to the right hemisphere, so that the right hemisphere, with its bigger picture understanding of the world, with the fact that it sees the whole, can actually make use of all of that data and information in a way that is helpful. So let me use this through the analogy he gives. He says you hear a piece of music. Okay. And you're perceiving the music as a whole. You're just enjoying it. You don't know what notes are being played. You're not looking for the melody. You're just in the moment, enjoying the music. And that's the right hemisphere. The right hemisphere is perceiving the whole and just participating in it and enjoying it. But let's say you want to now play the music. Well, the right hemisphere now hands the information off to the left hemisphere, and it begins analyzing, okay, which notes are being played? What key is this in? And it's trying to get all of the timing correct. And so the left hemisphere, very powerful, goes to work, breaking it down into all of its pieces and parts and creating the sheet music out of it. Now, the left hemisphere, once it's done with its job, it could play the music. But if it played it, it would play it in a manner that is very stilted, very wooden. It would be robotic. It would be precise in particular, but because the left hemisphere is so focused on those details, it would fail to capture the flow of the music. It would fail to capture the verve of playing it with passion and energy, even with a little bit of inconsistency here. And so the left hemisphere hands the music off to the right hemisphere. And now the skilled musician, now that they have mastered the details, they can play the piece of music with passion and energy and vitality. And people can sense that vitality. But it's only in handing back off the information to the right hemisphere where that happens. So this is the right, left, right handoff that McGilchrist essentially says is the ideal pattern that we should follow as human beings when we're engaging with new information material.
Great. So you could imagine, right? And I think that he's trying to bring this out in the second section of his book, where he's going through a historical analysis of the trend towards the usurping of the master's role by the left hemisphere as a trending pattern throughout human history and within particular systems of human history, particularly in the West. So I think one could very easily, well, maybe not so easily, but I think that linking this back to what you had said earlier about the phenomenon that has sort of emerged through the internet in the rise of Jordan Peterson or John, like all of these people, that it's like there's this nuance that's emerging that people who have engaged themselves in arenas or like social groups that have ontological explanatory power about the nature of the world, where they're like, say, Christian paradigms can't account for what these new perspectives are saying. And so that puts a little bit of a cog in the wheel and causes those groups or those individuals to kind of either back up in humility and start to question whether they need to start handing this off to their more primordial intuitive senses that are characterized by the right hemisphere, like you're saying, and allow a reformulation of what it means to be in the world. So I think if people are listening carefully, and it's hard if you're hearing this for the first time, but you can probably just intuitively start to see from what Tanner is saying that we seem to be in a time period where there may be an opportunity for a handoff. We might be in the middle of, and we don't want to miss that. So, Tanner, I don't know if you would agree with that, and or not.
No, I think I would. And, this is something that I actually think not only do I agree that we not want to miss the opportunity, I think it's the trajectory of, humanity in general, if you will. And as the trajectory of humanity in general, we as the church want to be at the forefront of this, not to be relevant, but because, I believe that culture and community end up being downstream from the church community and Christianity. And we should be in that sense, pursuing these things in a way where people are taking notice of us rather than us always being on the back foot. I think down through history, oftentimes, especially in Protestant circles, we've found ourselves on the back foot. And in reality, I don't think there's any need for that. And I think that we would be much better off if the church itself were leading some of these cultural charges.
Yeah. So, that kind of brings up, we had I don't know, in my opinion, we kind of had a little bit of a big event happen last night on Beyond the Fundamentals, because Kevin hosted an interlocutor where he seemed to be Kevin seemed to be trying to ask questions that were sort of poking at the point that I think you're kind of getting at, which was, okay, fine. I mean, I've been around Christianity for so long. I know what its, what its assertions are, what it's trying to say. But what about this? Like, what about what is it actually doing? Like, when we look at it from maybe more of a phenomenological standpoint, like, what's actually happening here? And then comparing that to, looking at some certain, what we would consider secular communities, and seeing what they're doing in there's cases where you start to see, like, people practicing something like distributed cognition in trying to, execute some kind of problem solving in, say, the business world or something like that. And then you go and you read, like, Paul's letter to the Ephesians, and you see in, like, chapter 4 that there's this like exhortation of an edification modality where it seems very monolithic, from pastors, teachers, preachers, what have you. And then he says, well, this is what it's going to be until this thing happens. And then he gives you another edification model where it seems like the communication mode is more like distributed and self edifying and like in a reciprocal way. So it's functioning structurally as like an autodidactic sort of entity. And it's like, wait a second, that sounds like the body. That sounds like how a body works. And Paul's like, he stamps it with the body of Christ. And so you're thinking to yourself, how are these so-called secular people, accessing and practicing these kinds of things that when I step back and I look at it, what are they actually doing? It's, why is this happening? And what is the thing that might be causing Christianity to, like you said, fall downstream culturally?
Yeah, I think there's a lot of insight there. There's a saying I'm fond of. It's, none of us are as smart as all of us. And I think it ties in exactly to what you're saying, because once we distribute that thinking power, we come to greater solutions and conclusions because we all have a variety of perspectives and ideas and understandings. And insight is iterative. It's something that happens through multiple times of looking at something, wrestling with something, asking somebody about those ideas, engaging with them, thinking about it again, reformulating. And this iterative insight, I think, is huge. And as you said, there are people receiving insights from these in a very secular way, secular environment. And we as Christians believe it, we believe that we have the truth in the Bible and in the Word. And so the question simply is, where is this at that we've been missing it? And I love, that you went to the scriptures there and showed there seems to be this sort of understanding there as well when you just read there in the text. And it's like, okay, now the application of that is one of the key ideas. You know, when we talk about the left hemisphere kind of taking these things over, what I think this is something that has happened down through history with the West in its entirety. You know, around the Enlightenment time, you know, you can argue about when it started or something like that, but we became very obsessed with efficiency, progress, technical understandings. All of these are hallmarks of the left hemisphere. So and that left hemisphere grabbing a hold and holding it tight to the chest for years and years and years and years, we have developed the society and the world in which we live. Again, it's very, very powerful, but there needs to be a handoff back to the other side. And I do think the church has done precisely this same thing. I think that Protestant Christianity in many ways tied itself to the Enlightenment, and we saw this happen. We saw this movement occur. And here's what I want to say. I'm not mad about that. I'm not upset. Like, a lot of people will denigrate that and say that was wrong, that was improper, that was inappropriate. I don't think so. Again, the left hemisphere is powerful. So we have developed fantastic theology and doctrine and ability to exegete the word, grammatical, historical hermeneutics. We've developed so many fantastic tools for ourselves over these many years since the Enlightenment and Protestantism took off. But at some point, the left hemisphere needs to hand it back off to the right hemisphere. And I think we're at that historical point. I think that's what we're seeing with all of these different movements around. People are noticing it in secular society, and they're not even approaching it necessarily from a religious perspective. They're just saying, wow, looks like all of the meaning was sucked out of my life because I'm so focused on the left hemisphere chopping up my world into bits and parts, and I'm looking for some meaning. And so they start going out there searching for meaning. Oh, wow. The right hemisphere starts to come into play. And now I have meaning. Now I have purpose. Now I feel like I'm a part of something greater than myself. I think these are just all indicative of the movement that we are seeing right now at our unique point in history.
So this is really wonderful. And, you know, one of the things that I'm noticing in this conversation and so far is that I didn't prompt you to like go into how you think that this left hemispheric, you know, tyranny has sort of moved its way through history, especially in the context of Protestant Christianity, which lets me know I was intending on asking you that. But what's nice is that whatever move, like whatever move I made or oriented you towards initially was sufficient enough for you to move the night exactly in that pattern. And so we're on the same page in a very deep way, which is really awesome. I really wanted to bring that out because so now I know that wherever I'm trying to adjust and bring the conversation or orient the conversation, you're already like putting the night on the square that I want it to be on. Right. So this is perfect. So one of the next things is, so in the analogy or the metaphor of the master and the emissary, there's a resistance or due to hubris or pride on the part of the left hemisphere to hand its let's say its analysis back over to the function of the right hemisphere. And so if that metaphor applies culturally, and particularly in Protestant or Christianity in general, there will be pushback, there will be resistance for that to happen, and you'll probably get some sort of mischaracterizations of particular, like, let's say, right hemispheric calls to the left hemisphere to, hey, you need to give this back. And so one of the ways that might come out is something that I'll just group together and say is like something like the charismatic movement. right? Where there's this emergence of, or a call on the part of the organism to say, hey, like, we're missing something here in terms of a connectedness to the world. And that growth or that call might in some ways be a little bit malformulated because it doesn't have sound analytic power to discern itself. It's just kind of intuiting things without any sort of powerful discernment, if you will.
Yeah, I'm tracking with you exactly on this, and I agree 100%. A lot of cultural expressions that you find that seem pseudo-Christian or Christian adjacent, or that seem to parallel Christianity but throw out too much of the doctrine, are, I believe, just like you're describing, the right hemisphere grasping back its power, but not doing so in a way such as to preserve the insights that the left hemisphere had found. If we want to go back to the music analogy, it's as though while the right hemisphere was watching the left hemisphere try to get all of the notes in the right place, the right key in the right place, etc., the right hemisphere got fed up and said, you know what, I've heard it enough times now, I can figure out how to play it myself. And they're going to sit down and try to play it, and they'll get it wrong because they're not allowing the insights of the left hemisphere to shine through. And so, yes, I think you see cultural expressions of this all the time where people sense the lack. They recognize there's something missing here. You know, this isn't how faith should be. And they're trying to snatch and grab back at it, but they're throwing out all of the insights we've gleaned in the process. And I think that's disastrous. What I am constantly referring to here is that we need to integrate the two hemispheres and let them both do their job. We're not trying to throw out one or the other. And if we focus on one to the exclusion of the other, we're going to have a truncated perspective. Instead, we integrate the two hemispheres in a both and kind of way. I actually like to think of Jesus himself as the paradigm for this. He is both God and man. He's 100% God. He's 100% man. And if you read the creeds, he's not intermixed. He's not intermingled. We're not trying to do a 50% left hemisphere thing, a 50% right hemisphere thing. There's no commingling, co-mixing, anything like that. We allow the God part of Jesus to do its good and important and essential work, and we allow the man part of Jesus to do its good and important essential work, and he integrates the two. I think the church is the same way. We have the left hemisphere, we've got our theology, our doctrine, great insights, powerful stuff, and we've got the right hemisphere, lived in practice and insights gleaned in a very experiential way, right? We want to integrate those and not jettison either of them. And I think so many of the movements in our current culture and society focus on one or the other. They're exclusionary. Jesus is 100% man, and that's it. Or he's 100% God, and that's it. And they refuse to integrate. And I think the church is reaching a point where we must integrate. A lot of people, when I start talking about things like this, they get nervous. Are you progressive? Are you abandoning the foundations of the faith? Not at all. Those are essential. We must hold to them. We must adhere to them. We want to add the right hemisphere back in. We want to hand the material off so we can live with verve.
Right. It's almost like you want to say, no, it's not a departure from the faith, because the faith is not reducible down to this set of, propositional assertions that must be, uttered and, like catapulted at everybody else at all expenses. That it's almost the antithesis to that, which is a return to the Father, a return to a participatory relationship, embodied relationship to God. Because ultimately, when, this isn't an absolute statement, but if God is not God is definitely not the kind of being that is like a stagnant, like artifact, right? He is very much a process relational being. When people start describing, the Trinity, one of the best ways to do that is whether or not the actual proposition set of it is true, the point is that I'm trying to point out to you a relation between a father and a son, and the spirit of that relation. That's a way to describe God as a relational being. And so, for the audience, one of the ways that I've also sort of thought about this, the roles of the left hemisphere and the right hemisphere, which Tanner brought out in the person of Jesus Christ as fully God and fully man. Another way that I've kind of conceptualized it is to think of God the Father as the initial intentional motivation casting being that sends forth his son as emissary for him. And that what we see in the Gospels is at a certain level is the perfect relation and orientation of the Father sending forth his son, who then in return and in submission returns back to the Father through the mode of the gospel, the death, burial, and resurrection. And so this right left hemisphere handoff that you're talking about is very much seen in the characterization of what's going on with Jesus in the Gospels, where this is my only son, who, like that. Then Jesus says things like in John, where I proceeded forth out of God. So it as if he is the logos, or the emanating thing coming out of the Father, and dissecting and discerning and creating and dividing all things, which then in turn return back into the bosom of the Father and come back out. And there's this very process relational dynamic in that kind of an understanding of the Father and the Son.
Yeah, I think I'm tracking with you here, and the categories map. If you want to think of it in these terms, it can be helpful as well to conceive of the Trinity. If you want to think of, Plato talked about the realm of forms, all the ideals, and then you have the particulars, right? And if with the setup that you're giving me here, the Father is in that sense in the realm of forms. He's in the realm of the ideas, right? He is God, eternal, the ineffable. He's incomparable, unimaginable, all those types of things. And then Jesus comes and he is the particular. If you want to know what I'm like, look at my son, right? Yes. Philip says, show us the Father, it will be sufficient for us. Have I not been with you the entire time, Philip, and still you do not recognize me? He's the exact imprint of his nature, right? And so I think it maps pretty well, actually. You have Jesus come, and he is the particular that we can now see. This is what God looks like if he were a particular, right? And then he returns and comes back to God, right? So I think that definitely maps. Of course, the Trinity plays into things as well. But I can see where you're going with that. And I think there's definitely some insight there.
Yeah, no man cometh to the Father but by me. Right. That's a great, I love that application of Plato's theory of the forms in regard to the narrative interplay of God as Father and God the Son. So one of the other things you mentioned was a retooling of discipleship, right? So
yeah.
What are you meaning there?
Yeah, this is a really important idea to me. I think for too long, because of our emphasis, we've been stuck in a left hemisphere mode for so long in Protestant churches. We have conceived of discipleship as discipling the head alone. Discipleship is jamming information into your brain, right? We treat people in the church often as brains on a stick into which I have to smash all of the doctrine and theology. And you are growing in your level of discipleship to the degree to which you are able to regurgitate back to me all of the theology and doctrine. But what about the rest of the human being? We are not just a brain on a stick. We have a heart, feelings, emotions. Love is to be drawn out of us towards God and towards other people, right? And not only that, we have drives and desires, motivations, a will with which we engage in the world. And our actions and our feelings and emotions both need to be discipled as well. And I think we've been treating in Protestant churches, because of our right emphasis on doctrine and theology, we've been treating people in Protestant churches as though discipleship merely needs to happen to the head. And we're leaving out 2/3 of the person as far as I'm concerned.
Okay. So in your personal, like congregation, without getting, too revelatory or anything like that, have you been able to relay what you're seeing in an effective way, and how have people been receiving it, basically?
Yeah, it's a great question. And to a degree, in a sense, some of these things that we're digging into, especially as it relates to the analytical side of things, is kind of outside of the salience landscape of your regular Sunday attendee. They're not kind of tracking with all of these interesting ideas and debates. But what they really resonate with are the representations of these ideas that they're dealing with in everyday life. And so what we've done in our church, we've actually completely changed the discipleship program, and we call it Head, Heart, Hands. And we actually added 2 more onto it: feet for outreach and ministry, and then family, which is relationships and relating to one another. And what we've emphasized is discipleship doesn't just happen to the head. It also needs to happen to the heart, to the hands, to the feet, and to the family as a whole. And that's been huge for us. And we actually put that forward in a strategic planning session with the entirety of the congregation. As a Baptist, we're congregationally ruled. And so everybody had a vote on whether or not we're going to do a new thing or not a new thing. It wasn't just my idea. I had a few concepts from what I've been exploring, as you've been exploring similar, veins. And I kind of threw these out, and we tossed them around, and we ended up meeting for 8 to 10 hours over the course of 4 different sessions on these topics. And the congregation really resonated with that framework. They see the need to disciple more than just the head. They recognize the importance of doctrine and theology, but they also recognize that their real lived experience needs work at times as well. And so some of what we've done when it comes to the discipleship program, and this is just underway. We haven't, it's not like we've been doing this for years and I've got tons of insights. We just started. We kicked it off this year. But some of what we've done is now with an individual member, they come into the church, they become a member. We are looking for 2 things. First, we're looking for your growth area. Where do you most need to be discipled? And it may not be theology and doctrine. You might need work on your devotional life. You might need work on your prayer life. You might need work on worship, right? Okay, well, let's focus you on the heart. Or you might need work in your areas of service. You like doctrine and theology, you're doing good, but you just are a consumer when it comes to church, and you're just getting what you need out of it, and you're not actually serving and involving yourself. So we identify the growth area. We work with—
Who identifies it?
What's that?
Who identifies it?
So we're just getting this going, but we have a new members class where we meet together and we discuss just some basics of, understanding personality, spiritual gifts, different things like that. We just kind of get those conversations on the table. And then as we're talking about that, the individual themselves identifies it, but it's kind of distributed like you're talking about. Right. I might know what questions to ask. They might say something that piques my interest. And so then I'll ask a different kind of question, and we kind of zero in and hone in on what they feel they most need to work on. And so it's working together with the individual over an extended period of time, over an hour. You need to ask a lot of questions, get to know your people, get to know the other people in the congregation, have real relationships. And as we're doing that, we're getting a sense of where you feel like you might need to grow. And it's not me assigning it to them. It's them assigning it to themselves. Right.
Naturally causing introspection, right? But also not leaving them out in the desert to just kind of, self-envelop constantly, leaving them with other people that can allow them to gain a distributed parallax on themselves, right? It's hard to see yourself, right? So if you can develop people around you who, are aimed at something similar, you can trust that their perceptions are, let me put it this way. On Wednesday nights, we try and execute this distributed cognition across scripture. And so we've been doing it for a while now. And one of the things that I've sensed and felt is a sense of mutual trust between me and other people in the group, because like the Greeks say, know thyself. And so one of the things that I think that they're oriented towards, that they have relayed to me that they're oriented towards, is they have a knowledge of their own ignorance or their own proclivity for self-deception. And they're oriented towards overcoming that self-deception. And so one of the biggest things that kind of, attracts me to their insights and their perspectives, their parallax on scripture or on me or whatever, is the fact that I can trust that they're not going to betray the master. That they're going to stay focused on the fact that they don't know what they don't know, and that this is the space that is optimized, that's optimal for insight. And so are you finding that that's a sort of necessary precondition for someone to participate in this type of social interaction?
Yeah, it's a good question. And we're too early in the implementation for me to see the necessary fruit in the way that you're asking. But I've got plenty of experience with counseling and interacting with people. And what you just identified is 100% the case, because the first step in anybody overcoming a particular pathology that they're dealing with is for them to attend to it. They need to recognize it, see it, and then they can begin to make progress. If you're blind to your particular faults or foibles or different things like that, then you're not going to be making the right insights. Okay. You might have some knowledge or some information, but you're not going to be developing that insight that you need to actually transform yourself. However, once you draw somebody's attention to something through asking questions and working with them in a reciprocal way, then they begin to form insights for themselves. This is actually a key in this area. People need to come to the recognition experientially. They need to have that moment themselves. How many people do we know who came to Christ through some bottom of the barrel, situation where I had to come to the end of myself? This person, that person, those other people were all telling me, and sure, I could have taken their advice, but instead I had to learn it the hard way. This is something you too. Yeah, exactly. And this is endemic to human nature. I don't know how many times I've sat down early on, especially before a member of my congregation, I start asking them a few questions and I immediately know what their problem is. And I know how they can fix it. I could tell them in 2 sentences what to do. They will never do it because it hasn't become salient to them. It hasn't become something that they have experienced. However, if you're interacting with somebody in this reciprocal way, affording insight through questions and being very particular about what you're asking, they'll begin to come to realizations for themselves. And those realizations for themselves are actually something that will stick. And so I've noticed that time and time again in the personal counseling sessions I've had with people.
Yeah. So, and, to add a little bit to that, it doesn't, in my experience, it doesn't necessarily need to be this cliche of, there's this issue and a person has an issue, or, like you used like a pathology, and that they have to somehow come to look at it as if it is the actual problem. You know what I'm saying? Like, just in a concrete sense, if my phone is actually the problem, right? It's not that I have to come to realize that the phone itself is the problem. It's almost like I have to come to realize the more right hemispheric, broader sense of I have an issue with that I have an issue that is generally self-deceptive. And so, you know how, like, if you're trying to solve a problem, like a math problem or whatever, and you start like hyper focusing and on a specific instance or a specific variable of that problem, then you lose sight of the fact that there's other things that are outside of the periphery that you need to zoom out and just see, take a deep breath, which is why they recommend, like, hey, just walk away from the problem and then return to it, right? So it's not even, I don't know that, like, necessarily that they need to somehow have this, supernatural revelation of, oh, it was this thing. It's like the sometimes the best starting point is kind of what we're saying in the conversation, is maybe a handing over of the analysis back to the bigger picture, the parts of you, like the right hemisphere, that understand intuitively and see the bigger gestalt of the thing. And then, with that broader bandwidth of perspective, the panorama effect, maybe you might be able to understand and gain insight that you were looking for in the first place, instead of like, I can't get it,
Yeah, I think that makes perfect sense. And I agree 100%. A way I like to think of this, I haven't formulated a good way of talking about this yet, but the way I've described it before is there are some things that can only be seen with your peripheral vision, if that makes sense, right?
Yeah.
That if you stare at something directly, that is powerful and helpful, but there's a depth of insight at the periphery that when you focus intensely, you lose, and you're losing something genuine that's needed, right? My wife and I were talking on this very topic about there used to be a thing with these pictures where you kind of had to stare at them and go cross-eyed a little bit. And there was like an animal in the picture. It looks just like a bunch of shapes. I forget what they're called, but it looks like just a bunch of shapes on a page, and you can't see anything. It just looks like a bunch of shapes. But if you kind of change your focus and you don't focus directly on the picture, but instead you focus in front of the picture, behind the picture, you can see an animal begin to form in the picture itself, right? It's there, but you couldn't see it when you looked directly at it, right? And I think in this situation, utilizing what we've been talking about, we are seeing the shortcomings of the left hemisphere. There are just certain things it doesn't do very well, and that's okay. There's nothing wrong with that. God gave us both a left and a right hemisphere for a reason.
So I don't want to shift gears like too randomly, but when you said God gave us both, you had mentioned in our phone conversation that you kind of have like some ideas on when and how that might have been happening, or that might have occurred, which I thought I might want to try and dig into, because I thought it was really interesting.
Are you referring to Eden?
Yes.
Okay. I mean, I'm happy to jump into this. These are ideas that I've been rattling around in my head for months and months and months now. If any of this is heresy, I gladly renounce it, right? I'm just trying.
Let me say this for you.
Yeah.
The point of this series, and I'll just generally what this series is embedded in terms of Beyond the Fundamentals, is to try and cultivate and open up a space for people to come into and overcome their own self-deception. And so, again, moving myself and appropriating the role of the brain or the right hemisphere here, I want to very much try and afford you a midwifery, so that the ideas, remember when Paul says, like, my little children, I travail in birth till Christ be formed in you. That is very much the spirit of midwifery that I want to offer you. And, so that sometimes I like that will include as the brain, like limiting the piece that you can move. So I have to put inhibitors in place so that you can focus on what's right. And so you just go for it, dude. Don't worry about it. Say what you got to say. Where the Spirit of the Lord is, there's liberty. You know what I'm saying?
I love it. Okay. Well, I will graciously accept your offering, your gift. So one of the things that's associated with all of these discussions, Pajot's channel is popping off with biblical symbolism. We're beginning to recognize there's more going on in the text than just grammatical historical. I actually think one of the things we need to figure out how to do is hermeneutics. And again, it's a both and for me. I love the grammatical historical hermeneutic, but I want to add to it. I want to supplement it. I want to say God's word is even deeper than this. It's true on that level, yes, but it's also true on a deeper, more foundational type of level. And I think that's what people like Jordan Peterson have been tapping into. They've been tapping into this other side of scripture that because we're so focused on grammatical historical and literalist left hemisphere battles for so long, we've been very rigid. And again, I'm okay with all of that, but I want to supplement it. I want to add to it. And so I've thought a lot about the garden and what was going on in the garden and what is the knowledge of good and evil and, all of those different things. And one of the things our world is colored by, our fallen world, and I'm not saying this is endemic to a fallen world, but our fallen world is very much colored by dichotomies, right? You have either or things going on throughout the entire world. Our world is very dualistic, and you could just name dualisms. If you look into symbolism, there are just dualisms after dualisms listed right next to each other: male, female, good, evil, on and on and on you go. You have all these dualisms. And I as I was thinking about left and right hemisphere, I kind of wondered if the Edenic state in the garden wasn't colored by so many dualisms, that actually in a proper integration of the person, left and right hemisphere, a proper perception of reality as it is, perfectly integrating both, is not what was going on in the garden. And if that's what was going on in the garden, then perhaps this splitting that's going on from the garden into dichotomies, a world that is colored by duality, is part of this fall, part of this knowledge of good and evil that is so difficult. These dualisms hurt us as human beings. There's something we struggle with, we wrestle with it, and it's something that is a trial that we end up working through. Now, here's something that I think about it though. Just like the left hemisphere is powerful when used by itself, and the right hemisphere is powerful when used by itself, if you can integrate the two in a both and kind of way, a homeostasis, if you will, right? A hypostatic union, if you will. If you can bring both of them together and maintain the duality, now you have the power that each individual hemisphere affords while having the benefit of being perfectly integrated. So here's my formulation, roughly. I think in the garden, we were integrated but simple, right? That because we had never experienced the dualities, because we had never experienced this knowledge of good and evil in the garden, we were integrated. Therefore, things were good. Therefore, there was no sin or anything like that. We're integrated, but we're simple. There's
no distinction.
Yes, precisely. There's no distinction. Exactly right. And then after the fall, we begin to walk in a world of distinction. That's exactly right. Yeah. And a child, I think this is built into even a child. A child goes through this.
Yes.
At its most infant state, a child does not distinguish between itself and mother.
That's right.
It's one unit. And then over time, it begins to distinguish itself from its environment, from other caretakers, from other people. It begins to see, oh, that hurt me when I did that, and me alone, that experience. A child will go from a stage of referring to themselves in the third person. They just refer to themselves using their own name all the time, to referring to themselves as an I, right? They begin to distinguish from the world. And as they separate from the world, that, again, it's powerful, but it affords certain difficulties, problems, and trials. And
yes, but it also affords it also affords the erection of value structures, because if there's distinctions between things, then there's inherent inhibitors and therefore relevance realization of these different distinctions, and some things are therefore better than others, which just the invocation of the word better means there's a value structure there. So we're seeing the emergence of hierarchy in the form of value structure. So distinction also offers again, a hierarchical value structure, of which virtue might be some of them, or connectedness to God might be one of them. You see what I'm saying? So it's not all that because there's distinctions now, there's no unity, right? What that allows for is the emergence of something like unity to become valuable.
Right. I agree. And I think that's a great insight. And something that continues with this is those values continue to progress and to grow. And what I think we're moving towards in the trajectory, a lot of people ask me, why, if God knew we were going to fall, why did he allow it? And of course, free will plays into that. And there's a lot of discussion around that. But there's also a sense in which God is moving us, growing us. I delight in watching my son learn how to perform a skill. I could step in, right? And you're doing it wrong. Let me do it the right way, right? He's not efficient at anything. He does everything wrong and improper and all that type of stuff, but he's learning. And I delight in that. And I don't think that's far off the mark from how God views us and interacts with us. He delights in watching us grow in our values and our virtues and all of those things. So I think we're moving from the garden being a unified but simple state to now we have distinctions, and now we're moving to a culmination of a unified, and while still preserving all of the virtues and the value and the glory and all of that, we've made the distinction. So now we can tell, now we know the difference. And now we're moving on to greater heights so that the end is more perfect than the beginning, if that makes sense, because we have gone through this journey. So that's how I kind of think of it. I think we're moving back to a garden 2.0, but it's going to be all the greater, more glorious, more, beautiful than the simplistic, never differentiated version that we had in Eden. So that's my rough take.
So one of the things that I really want to express appreciation for in what I heard from you was that never in this exploratory explanation that you went through did I hear you inject a sense of morality as a value system. I like the example you used, the concrete example with your son wasn't morally morally injected. It was like I enjoy watching him learn skills, like how to throw a baseball. And so like that, if we just leave our sense of morality out of it, what we see is that in these value structures, say of skills sets and the training or cultivation of the ability to do something in the world skillfully and competently, what we see is that the emergence of a hierarchy of virtue that is devoid of morality. And so virtue takes on the characterization of, this is the skill that I'm oriented towards, that I'm trying to perform. And whether or not, like using a bow and arrow, there's the target, and I pull the arrow back, and whether or not I hit the mark, we would say that arrow, that it flew right and true because it hit the mark. We would say like that a proper carpenter is able to make two objects that are fitted together perfectly and in a virtuous way, in a true way, which brings us to which brings us into a new understanding of what it even means to believe something, and takes us into kind of like the etymology of the word, which is to believe in, to love something, to be in right. And I mean like right in terms of justified relation with that thing, which is true. And so it gives a whole new like perspective on virtue. And I just really appreciate that you didn't like, hastily inject like all of morality into, or our sense of morality into this phenomenon. So just wanted to try and appreciate that as best I could.
Hey, no, I appreciate that. And I actually think that, that maps pretty well onto Paul's discussion of law and the spirit. He says the law was our schoolmaster. It could literally be translated like cross guard, somebody who walks to me to school, right? The law is my schoolmaster to lead me to Christ so that I may be justified by faith. And now that we are justified by faith, now that we are in the spirit, now that we are in Christ, we no longer have the need for the schoolmaster, right? Yeah. And right. I actually think if you look at humanity as a whole, we see that trajectory. Israel is like the child that needs strict black and white rules so that they can orient themselves in the world. But as they progress and learn, they see the world has more gray in it than they previously realized, and how they interact with the world takes on shades of nuance that are spiritual rather than rigid black and white.
Yes. Because, so one of the things that like Kevin points out on the channel is, and that we've kind of said a couple of times, is that something like a notion of wisdom isn't and cannot be bound up by a set of rules or laws, if you will. So you can train up a child in all of the catechisms and all of the correct arrangement of like moralistic or belief assertions, and something like a COVID-19 pandemic happens, or Russia invades Ukraine or whatever, and you don't know what to do. It's like, so it's not through the generation or of these proposition sets or rule sets or laws that somebody can know how to act in a virtuous manner appropriate to the context of their situation. And so a lot of that's I'm trying not to say too much. You know what I'm saying? I'm trying to say something big picture so that you can dive into it, but try not to say too much as to lose people or anything like that.
No, I understand. And I think this is one of the primary reasons I'm a Christian, because it has to do with the transformation of the person. It has to do with character transformation. I say this all the time. Christianity has no interest in behavior modification. Okay. Trying to just get people to act the right ways. Okay. Christianity is about transformation that therefore results in virtue in all situations in which that individual is placed, because they are of the right constitution. They're now made of the right stuff, so that whenever they're in a situation, they can act as their heavenly Father would act. Right. Christianity is so bound up with the transformation of the individual. And we often, I think, too much focus on just the individual rule following or obedience to this rigid, strict set of commands. Don't get me wrong. I want you to live a virtuous life, but I want you to do that from within, right? Jesus says the Pharisees just clean the outside of the cup, but the inside is still dirty. And he says, if you clean the inside of the cup, and I like to picture this as though the water is overflowing, if you clean the inside of the cup, then the outside of the cup will be clean as well, right? That's the focus.
Interesting. So in terms of, so you kind of touched on it a little bit, but let's make the move. What are you looking for, or at least kind of I don't want to say, but kind of proposing, or at least what are you foreseeing as maybe a new perspective on what we mean by hermeneutics and things like, like biblical interpretation?
Yeah. So, hermeneutics for a long time in Baptistic and Protestant circles that I'm in, it's always been assumed that the grammatical historical method is the method of hermeneutic that is right and proper and biblical. How often have you heard something like, the text can never mean what the author never intended it to mean, right? And different things like that. This is all tied up with grammatical historical interpretation. I've taught grammatical historical hermeneutics in Bible study class after Bible study class, right? So that's been a focus.
So I want to point one thing out. When I hear that, if I'm trying to play the brain here and see the big picture, when I hear the historical grammatical method, it doesn't seem like a method to me. It seems like a perspective. You see what I'm saying? Like,
yeah.
Like, how could I, like, a method is something that is nested inside of a perspective, I suppose, but it's the actual execution or the relaying of how to perform a skill. Like, looking at the Bible through a historical perspective is a very unidimensional skill. Let's put it that way. Like, you know what I'm saying? It's not actually multivariable in the movements that one has to make. It's just, think about, try and acquiesce as to what the historical facts might have been. You see what I'm saying? So it's less methodological or procedural and more perspective, like kind of like a unidimensional perspective on something. So I didn't mean to interrupt you, but
no, that's okay. I think that helps. And I'm tracking with you. I believe I agree with that. It is reading the text through a particular lens or with a particular perspective. And so often, at least in circles that I have learned and, grown up in church and all that type of stuff, it is seen as the perspective. This is, if you are utilizing this perspective, you are reading the Bible correctly, is essentially how it's put forward, and I don't know how many times I've gotten in exegetical fights with somebody over, that's not what the text says. That's not what Paul intended, blah, blah, blah. And in at least the Protestant circles I run in, this is seen as how we discern truth, how we discern God's will, how we discern what the Bible means. Right. And so my proposal, I don't want to throw any of that out. Again, in the way that I've been talking about, I want to integrate. And I think that the grammatical historical perspective is valuable and adds a lot to us. And Bible scholars for many years have been getting insights for us into the text through a grammatical historical analysis of sorts. But I think we have been too quick to jettison other approaches to scripture and interpretation. There's a interpretive method called the quadriga, which is recognizes a fourfold nature to the scriptures, and the literal is one of those. Right, it is one of those. But there's
what
also
was it called again?
It's called the quadriga. Quadriga, and it's more often just known as the four. I want to say it's just the four interpretations or something like that. You could find it pretty quick with a Google search. But the idea is that the text is multifaceted. It has multiple dimensions. It's true on multiple levels. And again, I've just seen in my training, in churches I run in Bible studies I've attended, it's always assumed that the perspective, the glasses you're wearing that say literalistic interpretation, I'm looking at this with historical framework, etc., is just assumed to be the right one. And I think with the phenomenon of Jordan Peterson, we are seeing that it's not the only right way. I think it is one right way, but I want to supplement to it. I want to integrate. I want to add. And we have a rich tradition of this. Half of the early church fathers loved allegorical interpretation. If you go back into the medieval authors, they loved many of these different types of interpretation, right? And there's a moral sense to the scriptures. There's an allegorical sense. There's a literal sense. There's all these different senses. And I just want to open the door again for those discussions to be had, because in the circles I'm in, at least, if you found the literal interpretation, what the text says. It's a closed case.
Yeah. So that's really great. I didn't know about that. And I've been kind of looking for these, I don't want to say alternative, what you would call hermeneutical methods or anything like that, because I'm not theologically trained. I'm philosophically trained. So my mind is much more oriented towards kind of always, it's almost plagued with always searching for what's the premise of this thing, and kind of trying to undermine it and I want to use this technically, understand the thing. So, that's caused me to sort of look into, I guess what you would say, different hermeneutical methods. One of them that is of interest to me is like Lectio Divina, and some other, I guess, I don't know if there's a formal name for them, but kind of assuming that there's a spirit or a meaning packaged inside of the words that is more than just semantic. It's that there's a deeply participatory relational sense of meaning that one can, acquiesce to and, come into a conformity with, right? So almost think of like wrestling with the text as if the text is a body, like an actual, like personified body that you're going to literally grapple with. And in order to, put it in submission, or it put you into that, you have to maybe be able to have the capacity to conform to the fluidity of movement that it's making. And you have to be able to pick up what kind of movement Paul or John is making, so that you can kind of, I hate using this word, but conjure up the emanation of what this person is trying to communicate to you. So I've come across some different techniques for being able to cultivate that kind of a presencing of the text. And just one of them that we might start trying on the channel is it's called chanting, but it's not chanting in this like woo-woo kind of way. All it is you take let's just say a verse. You can take a whole section, but a verse, and you have the group of people that are with you recite the verse slowly. And what will naturally happen, because of these distinctions like we were talking about before, and individuality, people will inherently, by their different perspectives, emphasize different phonetic sounds in the words and in the syntax of the verse that will allow an unlocking or a frame breaking that you brought to your perspective, and bursts open a whole new meaning. How many times in your life it's happened in this conversation where you say something in a particular way and emphasize a particular word, or kind of fractionate the phonetic of the prefix or the suffix of the particular word. And it's like, oh, now I understand this thing. That's the bursting open and the presencing through perspectival parallax on the particular passage. So that's just one technique we might try.
That's not the direction I was going, but I'm happy to add that, and I like that very much. I have taught Lectio Divina to my church. We had an individual, a Bible study with a smaller group, and I actually taught through how to participate in Lectio Divina. So I'm familiar with that, and I like that because, like you said, it's a participatory reading, which is very nice. And I've practiced that myself as well, at times, just working through that. But I've not heard of this chanting thing you're talking about, but it immediately makes sense to me. It makes intuitive, perfect sense because that's exactly right. It breaks the frame. I never would have emphasized that word. And then all of a sudden you experientially are viewing the text differently. You're viewing it differently and thinking of it differently. And yeah, I think that's fantastic. These are the sorts of things that going forward, as we as the church begin to, implement, these are the sorts of things I think we're going to be finding ourselves doing more and more and more of, because we're not just focused on the head anymore.
Right.
We're focused on the whole person. Right. So that to me is a fantastic thing. And again, what I would like us to get towards as well is bringing multiple perspectives, not only experientially, like you talked about, absolutely, but also analytically in a, exegetical way. Let me read through this through a framework or an understanding of biblical symbolism. Let me read through this looking for typology, and that's where I think a lot of what Pajot is doing is very impactful, because people are saying, oh, the Bible isn't one dimensional. It has a lot, it has a lot more for me than I previously had thought. I'd written it off, but I shouldn't have. And I think it's a both and. I want to take all the insights we've been gleaning since the start of the Protestant Reformation and beyond, and I want to continue to move forward with all of those insights and reintegrate the right hemisphere in its rightful place.
So this makes me think, like not to like toot our own horn or anything like that, but I think there might be a benefit, or I've got a hunch that using this like hand and brain analogy or, technique in chess, it as a potential hermeneutical method, right? So linking yourself up with another person, right? And kind of just, so part of the benefit of the hand and brain thing, in terms of if you're a chess player, is that you get to assign yourself a more defined role, which makes natural inhibitors to your perceptions and your framing of the chessboard. So you don't have to focus on moving the pieces if you're the brain. You have to focus on the big picture. And so you can put more cognitive horsepower behind that particular task, and vice versa with the hand. Now, if you were to try to do this as a biblical or a textual interpretation method, I'm curious if you were to put like parameters on yourself where it's like, I don't have to worry about what the my my really bad grammar skills, like I don't have to worry about that, because like this person has like some really great grammar syntactic skill, you know what I'm saying, like the hand or the left hemisphere. And it's like, maybe I can sit and try and see the big picture of the text, like what's the central idea, and have this person intentionally put out of their mind what the big picture is, right? So kind of like deflating all all of the horsepower necessary to try and uphold, oh, what was the historical context of this thing, right? No, don't worry about that. I got that. Don't worry. You just focus on what this is and report it back to me, and then I'll try and reorient. So I'm as a first stab at that kind of thing, I would like to see where that might go. I might try and throw that out to some more people and see if there'd be any interest or insight on that.
Yeah, I think that'd be a valuable exercise, and people taking turns at the different roles, I think would be valuable as well, because they're
right,
exercising different parts and aspects. And I could, as you were describing it, I was already visualizing it. I could easily see somebody just reading the text multiple times. Just what impressions are they receiving? What jumps out at them? What keeps grabbing them? What gripped them in their gut while they read? And it's like, those are the things that the right hemisphere person would be tuning into, right, and focusing on, rather than, like you said, all the grammar, the history, the background, all that type of stuff. So no, I it sounds like a really neat exercise, and I bet participating with multiple people and taking turns with the roles could be very valuable.
Yeah. So, well, we're coming to the hour and a half mark. So I'm wondering, I still have a lot of questions. So I don't know if there's any kind of maybe closing remarks or things that stood out to you in this conversation that, we could kind of try and relay and, go enjoy our Friday nights.
Well, I just as a summary idea, I guess, behind all of this is, I felt like the whole conversation, at least for me, was very insightful and helpful. And I appreciate you having me on. And these are the sorts of discussions I think we ought to be having in the church going forward. And so I am so thrilled and humbled to be a part of the conversation, honestly. To summarize, I guess, where I think I'm focusing a lot of my attention is that the reintegration of the right hemisphere is what we're going to be doing. I think that's going to be the program of the church going forward for, even decades to come, right? I really think that's the moment we're in, is we're going to be figuring out how to reintegrate. But the one thing that I'm constantly thinking about is there are a lot of pitfalls when it comes to this. There are a lot of landmines. Deconstruction is a very common term that's getting thrown around a lot, and a lot of people are treating that as though that's the answer. And to me, that's as bad as jettisoning the left hemisphere and saying, nope, we're going to do it ourselves. We need to take all of the insights we've gleaned in our churches, and we need to integrate. And integration looks to me like lived in practice. Integration to me looks like metaphor, allegory, picture, all of those sorts of things. And these are all characteristic of the right hemisphere. But how to do this well without falling into the traps that you noted in the conversation are happening in Christian adjacent and, Christianity light type circles. There's a lot out there that sacrifices Christianity itself, the core of it, in order to try and go into the right hemisphere. And we just have to be careful that we don't do that, right? Like to me, that's the thing I'm most concerned about. The things I talk about freak a lot of people out, right? They're nervous, but I do want to assure them I'm more Christian than I've ever been. I love Jesus more than I've ever loved Jesus, right? Like that's not changing, but that isn't to say that we can just remain stagnant in our mode and just be like, we got it all figured out. No. We have a lot of stuff figured out, but we certainly have more room to grow and to learn and to experience. And so that's, I guess, the one thing I would throw out there is people, it's hard because it takes a particular kind of open-mindedness to be able to walk down this road, to be able to learn and grow and assimilate without abandoning the roots or the foundation. And I mean, if you try to go down this path and you abandon the roots of the foundation, you're just swinging the pendulum all the way back the other direction. Humanity's been doing this over and over again, left hemisphere emphasis, right hemisphere emphasis. And we can just do that all day long, or we can actually get about the hard work of integrating and appreciating and valuing both the left hemisphere and the right hemisphere. And so to me, that's my biggest heart with all of this, and I guess if I were to give a closing statements on this kind of topic, that's where I would put the emphasis is we need to both and the world, but not in a way that sacrifices all of the insights we've gleaned up until now.
So this really reminds me, and maybe we can glean some wisdom from this portion of scripture, but it really reminds me, the image I had in my mind when you were saying that was Luke 15:11, right? The parable of the prodigal son. And what I saw was this characterization of like the departure of the son who goes and spends his father's wealth in the world, and then as he's returning back, part of the spirit of that story, or the meaning, right, the profound meaning, is how people deal with the reintegration of the extended part of you, and in this part, in this analogy, the left hemisphere. What happens when there's a reintegration that's happening with something, and you hear the part about the older brother who's like, well, what's this all about? Like, I've been time with you here, and he's all dirty, and like, you don't appreciate me. And the right hemisphere, in the form of the agapic love of the father, is like, well, buddy, if your focus is on the things that you have, or the things that your brother has or didn't have and now has, if that's what your focus is, then you're going to miss the point. You're going to miss all of what the joy is about, in terms of being under my house, right? You're going to miss out on the Father's love. And so that's kind of like the narrative form of what I'm hearing from you in this, in closing, by saying, like, we have to be careful about how we reintegrate, but not so careful that we miss the point, right?
That's exactly correct. You have to navigate the liminal space. And again, there's a ditch on both sides of the road, and that's it. We need to be open enough to receive something new, to see the movement of the Spirit. The Spirit is going to lead us in all truth. So we need to be open enough to that. When the Pharisees, were in their religious framework, and Jesus came up and started challenging their paradigms, they just chucked him out. He's a heretic. Get rid of him. Right. But he was the Son of God. Right. Yeah. And I think we need to be very careful that we're not missing the movement of the Spirit somewhere. So we need to be open-minded enough. But again, I've seen group after group after group that's too open-minded, if you will, and they end up abandoning the foundation, getting rid of all of it. Right. And so you're exactly right. I think that's a good picture for what I would suggest is our path forward as the church.
Well, Tanner, this has been such a blast for me. I have so much fun with this stuff, in spite of, other people's whatever. I hope that it was edifying, and that, we accomplished that layered approach in terms of trying to, draw out some kind of wisdom, and then also simultaneously practice that thing. It's like a fun game to me. So I just want to thank you for reaching out, and I'd like to try and, build off of this conversation and build off of the connections that we've been able to make. Cause it's just strengthening the unity. It's strengthening the capacity at which we can speak the truth in love to each other. So I thank you so much. And for everybody in the audience, you gotta wish Tanner and pray for Tanner's family. His wife is gonna go into labor soon, is what I hear. So next time I hear from him, he might be a a father of how many? now?
Of two. This will be my second.
Second, right. Right. So, brother, thank you so much. And, we're wishing all the best for you and your family, and we'll hopefully talk to you soon.
All of that is reciprocated. Thank you so much as well. I really appreciate it. I thank you so much for all the prayer. You guys are awesome. And yeah, I had a blast. This was super enjoyable for me. These are really important, topics and conversations, I think, for the church and to strengthen all of us going forward. So yeah, I had a ball and just blessed to be a part of this. And